In the stillness of the Atlantic, when the waves whispered secrets of centuries gone, one question continues to haunt the conscience of history: who truly profited from the transatlantic slave trade? This is not a story of distant lands or forgotten kings. It is the story of the modern world itself, built brick by brick, coin by coin, on the suffering of millions torn from their homes. It begins in the 15th century, when European ambition collided with African wealth and human life became a currency. Portugal's explorers, driven by gold and God, first charted the West African coast, searching for new trade routes, but what they found instead was the cruel opportunity to trade in people. At first, the enslaved were prisoners of war sold by rival African kingdoms, but soon the appetite for profit grew into a monstrous system that spanned oceans. Ships bearing the flags of Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands began to cross the Atlantic, their hulls filled not with spices or silk, but with men, women, and children shackled in darkness. The Atlantic Triangle was born. Europe supplied weapons, cloth, and rum to Africa. Africa supplied human lives to the Americas, and the Americas sent back sugar, tobacco, and cotton to enrich Europe's rising empires. It was a machinery of greed, calibrated to perfection, and behind every coin minted and every plantation built lay the broken spirit of human beings reduced to commodities. The ports of Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, and Amsterdam swelled with prosperity. Banks, insurers, and investors found in human bondage their most lucrative asset. The elegant drawing rooms of London and Paris glittered with wealth that had been harvested from misery. Sugar, called white gold, sweetened the tea of the aristocracy, while enslaved laborers worked to death in the Caribbean heat. Cotton from the American South clothed Europe, tobacco filled its pipes, and every product that delighted the senses was soaked in the sweat and tears of those who had no voice. But Europe was not alone in this vast transaction of cruelty. African kingdoms like Dahomey, Oyo, and Ashanti saw an opportunity to consolidate power through the trade, capturing rival tribes and selling them to European merchants in exchange for guns and manufactured goods. The trade fueled wars across the continent, reshaping societies and turning chiefs into merchants of flesh. Yet the ultimate profit did not rest in African hands. The real wealth flowed toward Europe and the Americas, where industries, banks, and cities were built upon the backs of the enslaved. In the colonies of the New World, European settlers and plantation owners found unimaginable fortunes. The Caribbean islands became the world's richest colonies: Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Domingue, each a factory of death and profit. Sugar mills roared day and night, producing fortunes for absentee landlords in London and Bordeaux. The economics were ruthless. A slave bought for £20 could generate 100 pounds of sugar a year. Lives were measured in yield, not years, and most did not survive long enough to see freedom. In the shadow of their suffering, Europe's industrial revolution began to stir. The profits from slavery funded shipbuilding, banking, and manufacturing. British insurance giants like Lloyd of London insured slave ships and their human cargoes. The Bank of England and many of Europe's financial institutions were built on investments tied to plantations and maritime trade. Even the grand universities and architectural marvels that still stand today owe their foundations to wealth born from human bondage. Across the Atlantic, in the young American colonies, the trade shaped the economy and culture of a nation before it was even born. The ports of Charleston, Newport, and Boston thrived as transit points, while the cotton and tobacco harvested by enslaved people became the backbone of the new republic. Northern merchants built ships for the trade and processed the goods that slavery produced, tying every corner of the Atlantic world to this web of exploitation. Meanwhile, in Africa, the cost was immeasurable. Entire communities vanished, cultures fractured, and economies destabilized. The continent lost not only millions of its strongest and most capable people, but also centuries of potential progress. The demographic scars are still visible today, echoing in poverty and instability. The transatlantic slave trade was not an accident of history. It was a carefully designed economic system that sustained empires for over 400 years. Spain and Portugal initiated it. The Dutch perfected it with their ruthless efficiency, and the British industrialized it. The French, too, expanded it to feed the insatiable demand of their Caribbean colonies. Every empire that touched the Atlantic profited from its human toll. In the Americas, slave traders became nobles, plantation owners became political leaders, and nations rose on foundations of stolen labor. By the 18th century, slavery had become the engine of global capitalism. The sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton industries were the oil of their era, and their profits flowed into the coffers of European monarchies, investors, and commoners alike. Yet, even as millions suffered, voices of resistance began to rise. Enslaved Africans rebelled, fought, and escaped. Heroes like Toussaint Louverture in Haiti and countless unnamed men and women who defied their chains. Abolitionists in Europe and America began to question the morality of a system that claimed civilization while committing barbarity. But the end of the slave trade was not born from compassion. It was driven by economics and rebellion. The Haitian Revolution struck fear into every colonial power. The costs of maintaining slavery began to outweigh its profits as industrial machines reduced the demand for human labor. Britain, sensing a shift in economic tides, outlawed the trade in 1807, followed by other European powers. Yet abolition was not justice. Compensation was paid not to the enslaved, but to the slave owners, preserving their wealth while the victims were left with nothing. The economic structures built on slavery simply evolved. Plantation profits turned into investments, colonial companies replaced slavers, and new systems of exploitation, colonialism, debt, and forced labor continued under new names. When we ask who profited most, the answer lies not just in numbers, but in legacy. The wealth extracted from the suffering of Africans became the seed capital of the modern world. The skyscrapers of New York, the banks of London, the universities of Europe, and the industries that powered the 19th century all carry the invisible fingerprints of slavery's profits. Even today, global inequalities mirror those old trade routes, with the descendants of the enslaved often trapped in poverty, while former colonial powers remain among the richest nations on earth. History tries to sanitize the past, to bury the truth under monuments and polite silence, but the Atlantic still remembers. Beneath its waves rest the bones of millions whose only crime was to be born in a world that measured worth by skin color and greed. And yet, from their suffering rose cultures, music, and resilience that continue to shape the modern world. The spirituals, the blues, the art, the language of survival that refused to die. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just about who profited, but who endured, who resisted, and who reclaimed humanity from the darkness. It is a story without heroes, only lessons. It shows us how civilization can coexist with cruelty, how progress can be built on pain, and how the wealth of one world can mean the ruin of another. The merchants who counted their coins in Bristol and Bordeaux, the bankers who financed ships in Amsterdam, the kings who sold prisoners for muskets, all believed they were part of something necessary, even divine. They could not see, or chose not to see, that history would one day judge them not as pioneers, but as profiteers of pain. And so, as we look back across centuries of trade, the question is not merely who profited most, it is who still profits today. The echoes of that old triangle still shape our economies, our cultures, and our moral compass. The demand for cheap labor continues in new forms. The exploitation of the vulnerable persists under different names. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade is not locked in the past. It lives in the inequality of the present. To understand who profited is to understand the system we still live in, the invisible chains of wealth and power that connect past to present. From the castles of Elmina to the plantations of the Caribbean, from the docks of Liverpool to the banks of Manhattan, the story of slavery is the story of global capitalism's birth. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of prosperity lies a debt unpaid, a silence that demands acknowledgement. The Atlantic winds still whisper the truth to those who will listen. History is not over, and its ghosts are not at rest. This is not a tale of pity, but of reckoning. It asks us to see beyond the numbers and confront the moral cost of progress. For the world we live in today, the economies we depend on, the luxuries we enjoy, were shaped by the trade in human lives. Until we face that truth, we will never truly understand our past or heal from it. And so, as the camera fades over the endless ocean, remember that every wave carries the memory of those who crossed unwillingly, every port hides the profit of their pain, and every nation built upon their labor carries a share of responsibility. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just history, it is inheritance. And only by acknowledging who profited most can we begin to repay what was lost. Subscribe to Dark History Files for more hidden history stories.